Which sacrifice in Leviticus was for the forgiveness of sin?
Oh gosh.
Many of them. There were several of them. As far as I understand, you had something like the Day of Atonement, right? Which was the big one. But you also had burnt offerings, you had forgiveness offerings, you had sacrifices for unintentional sins, as opposed to sinning with what the Bible called a high hand. I believe the wave offering was also used at certain times for sin offerings. So there wasn't a sin offering. It was actually largely, not largely, but often it was, what type of sin are you dealing with? And that would determine the type of sin offering that was to be offered.
Yeah, that's what I would say. It would depend. There wasn't a particular one. Depends on the sin. Depends on the different situations. So,
but the big one for Israel, for the nation, was the Day of Atonement. That was the one that was supposed to cleanse the people.
And that was a young bull, correct?
I think it was two. I thought it was 2 goats.
Yeah, that was the one where they would have the goat.
Well, I could be forgetting that there's a bull involved, but there's 2 goats. There's the one that's actually slaughtered, and the blood is sprinkled on the people and on the altar, and then the sins are Aaron was to take the sins of the people and place it on the head of the goat, and send that goat out into Azazel, into the wilderness. And that was to represent the right. Taking away of the sin out of the camp, away from the people.
Right. I thought, I could be wrong. I thought in Leviticus 4 it was the bull. It could be the goat. I think, to take it back to a Christology thing, though, is that if you read all of Leviticus in the Old Testament, for us, it's that God provided multiple ways for the people of Israel to get forgiveness. God's heart was always to reach out to try to bring us close. And like the wave offering, the blood, then you see, Jesus turned over the money changers in the table who were selling. It was their hearts that he was mad at, right? It wasn't that poor people, that was a thing. Poor people couldn't afford a goat or a bull or a sheep. So they would go and they would sacrifice a turtle dove, and God would accept it. It's a loving thing. It's weird to think of slaughtering a bunch of animals, but when you think of the many ways that God provided throughout Leviticus, yes, I'll be the first to say, I don't know, goat, bull, sheep. I know they're all in Leviticus, and I know that they were all made possible by God for forgiveness. And I think when we read that through the lens of Christ, not my own opinion, is that's what should stick out to us, is that God was willing to provide multiple ways in that time to be like, look, you can't afford a bull, get a goat. You can't have a goat, bring in 2 turtle doves. You ain't get a turtle dove, pick up some wheat and wave it at me and tell me. And as the prophet tells us, it's about where your heart is, right? He says, God said, sacrifices I have no more use for, because your heart's far from me. And so it was always about relationship with God. And I think my reading of Leviticus through a Christological lens is that, man, God is always the first to act. He's the first to step forward. He's the first to come towards us. He was the first to come towards Israel and make it possible for these wilderness herders, who were a tribal nation with dysfunction all around, to still be able to commune with God. And so I think that's where we get the term scapegoat. Now that I think about it, is that they would pray over the goat, and he would leave, and the sin would leave the community with him. But anyways, that's my 2 cents on that.
To jump on your point about, it being about love and it being about the heart, right? Because we see times whenever they're making the sacrifices and God is saying, no, I don't want that. I'm not pleased with that. But then you see other times where I think it was it Hezekiah that they figured out, hey, wait a minute, we're supposed to be doing this celebration and we're not doing it. And so they were hurrying to get everything ready. They didn't have enough priests, so there were Levites filling in the roles for priests. They weren't able to sanctify everything quite right. It wasn't even being held on the right day, but the scripture says God honored it.
Right.
It's like right down the line of the commands of this, celebration. They didn't have hardly any of it right, but God honored it because their hearts were for him. And so, nope.
Okay, Patrick, you're correct. I did a quick reading. The bull was for Aaron and his family and their sins, and then one goat of two they would cast a lot for, and one would be sacrificed to the Lord as the burnt offering, and the other one would be the escape goat that could go free.
So it's all of the above.
I think if I could add something, that it just as a note for people who are trying to read through sacrifices and understand what's even happening, is just draw some attention to the fact that that impurity is not the same thing as sin. And so a lot of times people will think like, oh, it was sinful to wear mixed fabrics or to touch a dead body in the Old Testament. It's not the case. It would make you impure, and it was sinful if you did it, with a high hand, that you were intentionally being like, I don't need to do that God law stuff. That might have been sinful, but there was nothing actually sinful. I mean, you became impure if a husband had sex with his wife. A woman was impure if she had her menstrual cycle. There was nothing intrinsically sinful about those things. It had to do with purity and impurity in a ritual sense. And so we shouldn't always think that those things are immoral or sinful necessarily under Old Testament law. And one of the reasons for that was to protect Israel from syncretism, from going after other gods and other nations. So, for example, if a man became unclean by having sex, what type of worship was not permissible in the temple? What type of worship was not permissible to worship Yahweh? Any type of temple prostitution, orgies, all that kind of. So you could not do what they could not worship God in the way that the nations around them would worship their gods, because that would just make them unclean. And so it's interesting to think about these sacrifices and realize the distinction between impurity and sinfulness.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing that I think a lot of people may not even realize, and those who do, we don't stress it enough, is because I know people that I've talked to who would now call themselves atheists, and really anti-Christian folks who talk about how Christianity, it just teaches that you're dirty and you're horrible and you're unclean and impure, and that language, to them, they're taking it as meaning, oh, well, that's a slight on your character, that it's saying, that you're this horrible, evil, wicked, not realizing that the language in the Bible about purity is a ritual thing, not a necessarily moral thing.
Well, I mean, and you could go farther, and I would say everyone, everybody, in apart from Christ, is horrible and wretched and sinful, and the desires of our heart are desperately wicked and depraved. I mean, I would say all those things, but what I think sometimes, and this is what you're touching on, is what that turns into is you're worthless and you have no value and you're like the worst type of human being and all that kind. It's not that at all. It's that when my righteousness is compared to God, I am horrible and wretched and depraved and terrible. But that doesn't mean that I have no value. I have infinite value because I'm made in the image of God. I image my Creator as a beloved creation that He's put His seal upon, and it's not as though my righteousness before God is the same thing as my moral obligations and my standing kind of horizontally to people. I can still be an atheist, can still be a good father and a good employee and a good boss and help old ladies across the street. It doesn't mean that like you're just this, like you might as well just be a homicidal maniac killing every people because you're just so bad. That's just a blending of categories that just isn't helpful.
Right.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to draw the same distinction that Tyler did, even in our Christian walk, that we are to be we should be becoming more like Christ as the Holy Spirit sanctifies us. But days that we might not become more like Christ than like on a Monday than a Tuesday doesn't mean that it's necessarily equal to sin. You can, our call to live a holy life doesn't necessarily mean that if we don't achieve this level of holiness today that we've sinned. That like you said, an atheist can be a good father. An atheist can be a good work employee. I mean, we can draw that distinction in Christianity. I think too that where we strive to be like Jesus and maybe fail doesn't necessarily mean that we've sinned. It just means like, man, I still need you. I still need you to recreate in me a clean heart. I still need you to continue to make me like you. I think that's a fair comparison, especially in reading, since we're hanging out in Leviticus, about the ritual purity versus uncleanliness versus sinfulness.